October 25th, 1944, 06:45 hours, the Philippine Sea. The horizon is grey, wet, and angry. Rain squalls slash across the water, hiding the deadliest naval force ever assembled by the Empire of Japan. On the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita grips the railing. His knuckles are white. He is exhausted. He has been under constant air attack for days. He has lost his flagship already and is now commanding from the Yamato. But right now, adrenaline is flushing the fatigue from his system. Through the powerful optical rangefinders, his lookout screamer report. Masts on the horizon. Kurita's heart hammers. Intelligence told him the American Third Fleet was lured away to the north. The path to Leyte Gulf, where thousands of American troops are landing on the beaches, should be wide open. If Kurita can get his guns into that bay, he will slaughter the invasion force and halt the American advance in the Pacific. He peers through the binoculars. He sees flat-top silhouettes, aircraft carriers. He sees escorts. A smile should be crossing his face, but it does not. Because the shapes are wrong, the silhouettes are too small. But his paranoia, fed by days of relentless American bombings, plays a trick on his mind. He does not see small escort carriers and tiny destroyers. He convinces himself he is looking at the giants, the fleet carriers, the heavy cruisers. The main strength of the US Navy. General attack, Kurita barks. All ships, attack. The Yamato shudders. This is the largest battleship in human history. It outweighs the Titanic. It carries 18-inch guns, weapons so massive they fire shells the weight of a sedan car over 40 kilometers. Beside it sail the battleships Kongo, Haruna, and Nagato, along with heavy cruisers and destroyers. It is a force capable of crushing nations. Across the water, roughly 17 miles away, a lookout on a tiny American ship freezes. He is aboard the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer, a tin can. It has no armor. Its hull is thin enough to be pierced by a machine gun. It carries 5-inch guns that look like toys compared to the monsters facing them. The lookout screams into the voice pipe. Japanese fleet, battleships, cruisers, the whole damn Navy. Commander Ernest Evans, the half-Cherokee captain of the Johnston, steps onto the wing of the bridge. He does not look for an escape route. He does not signal a retreat. He looks at the Japanese horizon, lit up by the flashes of the largest naval guns on Earth. The shells are already airborne. They sound like freight trains tearing through the sky. Evans grabs the squawk box. His voice is calm.
All hands to battle stations. Blank speed. Left full rudder. Captain, we are going in.
This is not a battle. This is a suicide charge. And it is about to become the greatest mystery of the naval war. Why? 2 hours from now, will the most powerful admiral in the Japanese Navy turn his invincible fleet around and run away from a handful of tin cans? To understand the impossible, we have to look at the board. The setup is a disaster. Admiral Halsey, commanding the fast battleships and heavy carriers of the Third Fleet, has fallen for a decoy. He is hundreds of miles away, chasing a Japanese carrier force that has no planes. He has left the back door to the invasion beaches completely unguarded. The only thing standing between the Japanese center force and the vulnerable transport ships in the Gulf is Taffy 3. This is not a combat fleet. This is a support unit. Taffy 3 consists of 6 escort carriers, slow, converted merchant ships jokingly called combustible, vulnerable, expendable. They carry slow bombers intended to hunt submarines, not fight battleships. Screening them are 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, ships so small the sailors call them barber poles. The mismatch is almost comical. The Yamato alone displaces more tonnage than the entire American unit combined. The Japanese heavy cruisers can outrun the American carriers. The Japanese gun range is nearly double that of the American destroyers. Mathematically, Taffy 3 is already dead. The Japanese computer simulations, had they existed, would give the Americans a survival probability of 0%. But Commander Ernest Evans does not care about math. "Commence making smoke," Evans orders. Black, oil-thick smoke pumps from the Johnston stacks. It hangs low over the water, mixing with the rain squalls. It creates a ghostly, artificial fog bank. The Johnston surges forward, tearing out of the formation. She is alone, one tiny destroyer charging a line of 4 battleships and 8 cruisers. On the Yamato, the Japanese gunnery officers are confused. The optical rangefinders on the Japanese ships are the best in the world, superior to anything the British or Germans have, but they rely on sight. The American ship is moving erratically. It is zigzagging, chasing the splashes. When a Japanese shell lands, throwing up a geyser of water, Evans steers the Johnston directly into the splash, betting that the Japanese gunners will correct their aim and not hit the same spot twice. It is a game of Russian roulette played with 18-inch projectiles. The distance closes. 18,000 yards. 16,000. Fire! The Johnston's 5-inch guns erupt. These guns are designed to shoot down planes or shell beaches. Against the armor of a heavy cruiser like the Kumano, they should be useless. But the Johnston is firing with computer-assisted radar control. The Mark 37 fire control system locks onto the leading Japanese cruiser. The American fire is rapid, rhythmic, and terrifyingly accurate. Hundreds of 5-inch shells hammer the Kumano. They smash the bridge. They shred the superstructure. They light fires. On the Japanese bridge, the officers are stunned. This volume of fire is impossible for a destroyer. They conclude they must be facing a heavy cruiser. The fog of war begins to thicken. But Evans is not done. He is now within 10,000 yards. Torpedo range. Fire torpedoes. 10 Mark 15 torpedoes splash into the water. The Johnston leans hard into a turn, retreating behind its own smokescreen. The Japanese see the wakes. The heavy cruiser Kumano turns hard to evade, but it is too late. An underwater explosion rocks the ship. The bow is blown off. The lead ship of the Japanese cruiser line is crippled, dead in the water, by a single tin can. But the price is paid immediately. As the Johnston emerges from the smoke, 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo slam into her. They tear through the engine room. The speed drops. The ship shudders like a dying animal. The bridge is smashed. Commander Evans loses 2 fingers on his left hand and takes shrapnel in his chest. The Johnston is crippled. She is limping at half speed. This is the moment where logic dictates surrender. The ship is broken. The weapons systems are failing. The captain is bleeding out. But Evans wraps a handkerchief around his mangled hand. He moves to the fantail of the ship, shouting orders through an open hatch because the intercom is dead. "More smoke!" he yells. "We act as a decoy." He sees the other American destroyers, the Howell and the Heermann, beginning their own runs. They have seen the Johnston's courage, and they are following her into the fire. The ocean turns into a chaotic, swirling mess of colored water. The Japanese use dye markers in their shells to identify whose fall of shot is whose. The Yamato fires pink splashes. The Congo fires yellow. The sea looks like a deadly watercolor painting. Deep inside the Japanese formation, Admiral Kurita is growing agitated. His plan relied on a swift, clean strike. But the water is full of smoke. His ships are breaking formation to dodge torpedoes. And now, the sky is buzzing. The planes from the Taffy 3 carriers are arriving. These are Grumman Avengers and Wildcat fighters. They are slow, ungainly aircraft, and they are launching with almost no ammunition. Some have depth charges meant for submarines. Some have fragmentation rockets, some have nothing at all. It does not matter. The pilots attack anyway. They fly directly down the throats of the Japanese battleships. They drop depth charges on steel decks, cracking hulls. When they run out of bombs, they strafe the bridges with machine guns. When they run out of bullets, they make dry runs. They dive at the Yamato, banking away at the last second. To the Japanese lookouts, a plane diving looks like a plane attacking. The Japanese battleships are forced to take evasive maneuvers. The mighty Yamato, capable of 27 knots, is reduced to swerving back and forth, unable to bring her main guns to bear. One American pilot, Lieutenant Commander Ernest McGunigal, has no weapons left. He sees a group of Japanese destroyers lining up a torpedo attack on the American carriers. He rolls his window down. He pulls out his service revolver. He flies over the Japanese destroyer, firing his handgun at the ship. It is absurd. It is insane. But it works. The Japanese are distracted. They break their aim. Back on the surface, the small boys are dying. The USS Howell is trapped. She is boxed in by battleships. She takes over 40 hits, her engines are gone, her guns are jammed. The crew fires manual control until the water washes over the deck. She goes down fighting. Then there is the Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort, the slowest, smallest class of ship in the fight. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, gets on the loudspeaker. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. The Samuel B. Roberts charges the heavy cruiser Chokai. The Sammy B is so close to the enemy that the Japanese guns cannot depress low enough to hit her. The shells scream overhead, passing through the rigging. Inside the Sammy B's gun turrets, the loaders are working like machines. The barrel is glowing cherry red. They are firing around every 6 seconds. They switch to star shells, magnesium flares, meant to illuminate the night, and fire them directly into the superstructure of the Japanese cruiser, starting massive chemical fires. For 1 hour, the tiny Samuel B. Roberts battles a line of heavy cruisers. She fires 600 shells. She rips the Japanese heavy cruiser apart. But physics is inevitable. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo strike the Samuel B. Roberts. It is like a sledgehammer hitting a tin can. A 40-foot hole opens in the hull. As the ship begins to sink, the survivors cling to rafts. They watch the battle continue. And this is where the mystery is solved. Admiral Kurita is looking at the battlefield from the bridge of the Yamato. What does he see? He sees heavy smoke blocking his vision. He sees aggressive ships charging him, firing with radar-controlled precision. He sees aircraft swarming his fleet, diving relentlessly. He sees cruisers burning. In his mind, he is not fighting a handful of escort carriers and destroyers. The ferocity of the American defense has convinced him that he is engaged with the main body of the American Third Fleet. He believes the baby flat tops are actually fleet carriers. He believes the tin cans are heavy cruisers. He looks at the tactical plot. His fleet is scattered. His fuel is running low. He has been fighting for hours against an enemy that refuses to die. An enemy that fights with a suicidal aggression he did not expect from Americans. Kurita breaks. At 12:36 hours, the order goes out. All ships turn north. On the burning deck of the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay, the American sailors cannot believe their eyes. The Japanese fleet, just minutes away from wiping them out, is turning away. The Yamato, the monster that could have ended them all with a single well-placed salvo, is retreating. The tin cans have done the impossible. They have bluffed the most powerful surface fleet on Earth. The aftermath is silence, broken only by the hiss of steam and the cries of the wounded. The USS Johnston is gone. Commander Evans went down with his ship. He will receive the Medal of Honor posthumously, the first Native American in the Navy to do so. The Hoel is gone. The Samuel B. Roberts is gone. Over 1,000 American sailors are dead or missing. But look at what they bought with their lives. The transport ships in Leyte Gulf are safe. The invasion force is untouched. General MacArthur returns to the Philippines. The Japanese Navy has fired it November 14th, 1979. A windowless briefing room deep within the grey, monolithic headquarters of the KGB's first chief directorate at Yasenevo, just outside Moscow. The air was thick with the scent of strong tobacco and stale tea, the only light coming from the green-tinged glow of a slide projector. Colonel Ivan Morozov, a man whose face seemed to be carved from the same granite as the building he occupied, tapped a wooden pointer against a grainy, black-and-white image projected on the wall. The image showed a line of gaunt, desperate-looking people snaking around a city block. It was a photograph from the American Great Depression, nearly 50 years old. But to the men in this room, it was not history. It was doctrine. It was truth. Morozov's voice was a low, gravelly hum, confident and absolute. "This," he declared, the pointer thumping the screen for emphasis, "is the fundamental, incurable sickness of capitalism. It is a system of artificial scarcity, of engineered poverty designed to discipline the masses. They have mountains of grain, yet their people starve. They produce cars by the million, yet their workers cannot afford them. This is the contradiction that will bring them to their knees." The young analysts in the room nodded in unison, their minds steeped in the unshakable certainty of Marxist-Leninist theory. They had spent their lives studying the inherent weaknesses of the West. They knew, with the certainty of religious faith, that the American system was a fragile house of cards, built on exploitation and destined for collapse. The official reports from their agents in the field confirmed it. They sent back detailed analyses of American labor strikes, of urban decay in cities like Detroit and New York, of racial tensions and political protests. Every piece of intelligence was carefully filtered through the lens of their ideology, reinforcing the narrative they already believed, that the Soviet Union, with its centrally planned economy and its commitment to the collective, was not just morally superior, but historically inevitable. The West was a glittering, decadent facade, rotting from within. The colonel advanced to the next slide. It was a table of agricultural statistics, showing Soviet grain yields steadily increasing, a testament to the success of collective farming. It was, of course, a complete fiction. Every man in that room knew the reality of Soviet agriculture. They knew about the disastrous harvests, the rotting potatoes left in the fields for lack of transport, the chronic shortages that defined daily life for 280 million Soviet citizens. They knew the truth because they lived it. Their own wives and mothers spent hours every day standing in queues, hoping for a meager ration of sausage or a few wrinkled onions. They were masters of the Blatt system, the intricate network of favors and connections required to obtain anything from a decent pair of shoes to a competent doctor. But in this room, under the unwavering gaze of the portrait of Yuri Andropov on the wall, the fiction was the only permissible reality. The lie was the state. To question it was not just heresy, it was treason. Then, a junior analyst, a bold young man named Viktor Orlov, cleared his throat. "Colonel," he began, his voice hesitant, "there is one report from the GRU's agricultural attaché in Washington. He speaks of something called a supermarket. He describes food availability that seems exaggerated." Morozov turned slowly, his eyes narrowing to slits. The projector hummed in the sudden, tense silence. An exaggerated report? It was a polite way of saying the agent was either a fool or a liar. Morozov had seen the report. It was fantastical, describing aisles of something called produce, with dozens of varieties of fruits and vegetables available year-round. It spoke of meat counters stretching for 50 meters, filled with every cut of beef, pork and chicken imaginable. It mentioned entire walls of refrigerated dairy, with countless types of milk, cheese and butter. It was absurd. It was decadent, bourgeois propaganda of the most obvious kind. Morozov raised a dismissive hand. The agent has clearly been compromised by Western disinformation, or perhaps he has spent too much time in the Langley cafeteria. We will have him recalled for re-education. There is no need to pollute our analysis with such fairy tales. The analysts shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to speak again. The fairy tale was dismissed. The briefing continued, reinforcing the comforting dogma of American decay. But for Viktor Orlov, a seed of an impossible question had been planted. What if the fairy tale was true? This dismissed report was a crack in the foundation of their entire worldview. It's the kind of hidden story we uncover every week here at Cold War Impact. Subscribe now so you don't miss the truth behind the secrets. The worldview that Colonel Morozov and his men defended so rigidly was not simply a matter of policy, it was the very architecture of their existence. The Soviet citizen was born into a world where the state was the sole provider, the ultimate arbiter of reality. From the cradle, they were taught that the centrally planned economy was the most advanced and humane system ever conceived. Capitalism, they learned, was chaotic, cruel, and wasteful. The anarchy of the market led to boom and bust cycles that threw millions out of work, while the greedy bourgeoisie hoarded the world's wealth. The official newspaper, Pravda, which ironically means truth, ran endless stories celebrating the triumphs of Soviet industry. Photographs showed smiling, heroic workers exceeding their quotas, vast fields of wheat stretching to the horizon, and gleaming new apartment blocks rising from the earth. The reality, of course, was a universe away from this glossy propaganda. The Soviet economy was a lumbering, inefficient behemoth, plagued by systemic flaws that were obvious to anyone who had to live within it. The central planners in Moscow, operating from the Gosplan headquarters, attempted to manage the economic output of a landmass spanning 11 time zones. They dictated the number of shoes to be produced in a factory in Minsk, the amount of steel to be smelted in Magnitogorsk, the number of tractors to be assembled in Volgograd. It was an impossible task, a futile attempt to replace the trillions of daily decisions of a market economy with the rigid decrees of a handful of bureaucrats. The result was a world of constant, surreal shortages and surpluses. A shoe factory might be ordered to produce 1 million shoes. To meet this simple numerical quota, the factory manager would produce 1 million shoes of the same size and for the same foot, creating a useless surplus while people went without footwear. A nail factory, given a quota based on weight, would produce a single enormous nail that was utterly useless. The entire system was geared toward meeting arbitrary targets on paper, with no regard for actual consumer need or demand. Food was the most critical and chronic failure. While Soviet propaganda boasted of bumper crops, the reality was one of perpetual struggle. Collective farming, which had destroyed the traditional, more productive peasant farming system, was notoriously inefficient. Even when a decent harvest was produced, a shocking percentage, some estimates say, up to 50% rotted before it could reach consumers, due to a catastrophic lack of storage facilities, refrigerated transport, and a functioning distribution network. The Soviet citizen's life was defined by the queue, the ochre. It was a daily ritual, a public display of the system's failure. People would line up for hours without even knowing what was being sold at the end of the line, simply on the rumor that a shipment of something, anything, had arrived. The empty shelves of the state-run gastronom stores were a national symbol. A common joke was a man walks into a fish store and asks, "You don't have any fish?" The clerk replies, "You've got the wrong store, comrade. This is the fish store where we don't have any fish. The store where they don't have any meat is across the street." This was the grim reality that Soviet intelligence agencies were tasked with both concealing from their own people and projecting onto their enemy. They were so immersed in their own world of scarcity and state control that they couldn't imagine anything different. They genuinely believed that the American system, stripped of its Hollywood gloss, must be even worse. They saw the West not as it was, but as their ideology insisted it had to be. Meanwhile, across the ocean, a completely different reality had taken root, born not from a grand central plan, but from a chaotic explosion of innovation, competition, and logistics. The American advantage in the Cold War was not just its fleet of B-52 seconds or its nuclear submarines. It was something far more fundamental, something the KGB analysts could never quantify: the astonishing efficiency of its system for producing and distributing the most basic necessity of human life, food. The genesis of this advantage began in the aftermath of World War II. While the Soviet Union was rebuilding its devastated agricultural sector, America was experiencing a revolution. The Green Revolution, spearheaded by scientists like Norman Borlaug, introduced high-yield crop varieties, advanced fertilizers, and modern irrigation techniques that sent agricultural productivity soaring to levels unprecedented in human history. American farms became the most productive on Earth, generating staggering surpluses of grain, corn, and soybeans. But producing the food was only half the battle. The true invisible miracle was the system that delivered it. The 1,950 seconds saw the construction of the interstate highway system, a logistical marvel that connected every corner of the country with high-speed, reliable transport. A head of lettuce grown in the fields of California could be loaded onto a refrigerated truck and be on a shelf in a New York store in 3 days, still fresh and crisp. And it was the destination of that truck that represented the ultimate symbol of this new reality: the supermarket. The American supermarket was not an invention of the state. It was the result of ferocious competition. Entrepreneurs like Clarence Saunders, with his Piggly Wiggly stores, had pioneered the concept of self-service, allowing customers to choose what they wanted directly from the shelves. This simple idea was revolutionary. It empowered the individual consumer, a concept that was complete anathema to the Soviet collective mindset. After the war, these stores exploded in number and scale. They were cathedrals of consumption, vast, brightly lit spaces designed for maximum choice and convenience. The psychological impact of this was immense. For Americans, abundance was normal. The idea of not being able to find bread, milk, or meat was unthinkable. Choice was a given. You didn't just buy cheese. You chose between cheddar, Swiss, provolone, mozzarella, and dozens of other varieties. You didn't just buy bread. You chose between white, wheat, rye, sourdough, and pumpernickel. This wasn't a secret policy or a hidden weapon. It was the mundane, everyday reality of American life. And it was precisely this mundanity that made it so incomprehensible to the Soviet mind. The KGB could understand a new spy plane. They could analyze the capabilities of a nuclear aircraft carrier. These were things that fit into their paradigm of state-on-state competition. What they couldn't understand, what they were ideologically blinded to, was the overwhelming power of a system that could effortlessly provide 20 different kinds of breakfast cereal to an average citizen in a small town in Ohio. They were looking for the enemy's tanks, never realizing that the most devastating weapon was hidden in plain sight, on aisle 7, right between the canned peaches and the potato chips. Boris Kirillovich Volkov was not a man given to fantasy. As a senior analyst in Directorate T, the KGB's scientific and technical intelligence branch, his entire career had been built on a foundation of cold, hard data. He dealt in blueprints, in telemetry intercepts, in stolen industrial processes. He had meticulously documented the West's technological achievements, but always framed them within the comforting context of dialectical materialism. To him, an American jet engine was a triumph of engineering, yes, but it was also a product of an exploitative military-industrial complex, an expensive bauble created on the backs of an oppressed proletariat. He was a true believer, not a cynical apparatchik. He had seen the poverty of his own nation, but accepted it as a necessary, temporary sacrifice on the long march toward a communist utopia. When he made the terrifying decision to defect in Vienna, handing himself over to a stunned CIA case officer, it was not because he had lost faith in the ideology. It was because he had been caught in the crosshairs of a vicious internal power struggle, a victim of a purge orchestrated by a rival. He chose defection over a shallow grave in the Lubyanka's cellars. He arrived at a quiet safe house in rural Virginia, a ghost still living in a Soviet world. He was guarded, arrogant, and dismissive of his American debriefers. He saw them as naive, their minds softened by comfort and bourgeois propaganda. In his first weeks of debriefing, he played the part of the superior intellectual. "You speak of freedom," he scoffed at his primary handler, a patient, unassuming man named Frank. "I have read your own government's reports on unemployment in your inner cities. I have seen the intelligence on your national debt. Your freedom is the freedom to starve. We may have temporary supply chain issues, but our system provides for everyone. No one is left behind." Frank would simply nod, making a note on his legal pad, never arguing. Boris took this as a sign of weakness, a tacit admission of the truth of his critique. He felt a smug satisfaction. He was teaching these cowboys the reality of the world. Frank mentioned they needed to go into town to pick up some supplies. Boris agreed, intrigued. He was eager to see the real America, to peel back the curtain and witness the decay he knew must be there. He expected to see a carefully curated Potemkin village, a show for his benefit. Perhaps they would take him to a special store for government elites, like the Berezka shops in Moscow, where high officials could spend foreign currency on Western goods. He steeled himself to see through the deception. As they drove down a wide, clean suburban road in a comfortable Ford sedan, Boris was silent, cataloguing the evidence for his preconceived notions. The houses were large, but he saw them as wasteful, individualistic boxes that lacked the collective spirit of Soviet apartment blocks. The cars were plentiful, but he knew they were bought on credit, chains of debt that enslaved the workers. It was all a facade, and he was the one man in this car smart enough to see it. Then Frank turned the car into a vast, sprawling parking lot. In front of them stood a long, low building with large glass windows. Above the entrance, a simple sign in red letters read, "Safeway." It looked ordinary, unassuming. There were no armed guards, no lines of weary people stretching around the block, just dozens of shoppers, dressed in casual clothes, moving in and out of the automatic doors with an air of utter nonchalance. Boris felt a prickle of confusion. This wasn't the elite government store he had expected. "This is it?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "This is where you shop?" Frank smiled. "Yep, this or the Giant down the road. Come on, I need to get some steaks for the grill." Boris got out of the car, his senses on high alert, ready to spot the trick. He was still confident, still the KGB analyst searching for the hidden truth. The automatic doors hissed open, and Boris Kirillovich Volkov walked into a wall of light, color, and sound that shattered his universe. The first blow was the sheer, overwhelming scale of the place. The ceiling soared high above, lined with humming fluorescent lights that bathed everything in a clean, shadowless glare. Aisles, impossibly long and wide, stretched into the distance. So far he couldn't see the end of them. They were packed, from floor to ceiling, with a dizzying variety of goods. But it was the produce section, right near the entrance, that broke his mind. He just stopped, frozen, a few feet inside the door. Before him lay a mountain range of fruits and vegetables. He saw pyramids of gleaming red apples next to pyramids of green ones. There were oranges, bananas, grapes, plums, strawberries even in the middle of autumn. He saw vegetables he couldn't name, strange, exotic shapes and colors from every corner of the world. Back in Moscow, a fresh tomato in winter was a luxury beyond the reach of all but the most powerful Politburo members. A banana was something a child might see once a year. Here, they were piled up like common stones, casually, almost carelessly abundant. He took a hesitant step forward and saw a fine mist spray over a bed of leafy greens, lettuce, spinach, kale, dozens of types, all of it crisp and vividly alive. He had never seen such a thing. In his world, vegetables were limp, dirt-caked things, if you could find them at all. He was stunned. He literally couldn't believe what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a stage, an elaborate theatrical production built just for him. Frank, noticing his silence, walked over. "You okay, Boris?" Boris didn't answer. He turned, his eyes wide, and looked past the produce to the meat counter. It was a river of red and white under a pane of gleaming glass. It stretched on and on, filled with every cut of beef, pork, lamb and chicken. There were rows of sausages, piles of ground meat, thick-cut steaks. The sheer quantity was horrifying. He thought of the endless queues in Moscow, the grimy butcher shops with their perpetually empty hooks, the greasy, bone-filled cuts of meat that were considered a triumph to bring home. The sight before him wasn't just abundance, it was a physical insult to the suffering and sacrifice of his people. He felt a wave of dizziness. He turned again, his gaze sweeping across the rest of the store. An entire aisle, one whole aisle, dedicated to nothing but bread. Another for milk and cheese, the refrigerated shelves humming with a quiet power, holding more dairy than he had seen in his entire life combined. And then he saw the cereal aisle. It was a kaleidoscope of color, a wall of brightly printed cardboard boxes, each bearing a different cartoon character, a different promise of sugary delight. He stared at it, baffled. Why would any society need this many different kinds of breakfast cereal? The sheer, pointless, glorious variety of it all was a form of power he had never conceived of. It wasn't the power of a tank division or a missile silo. It was the power of a system that could produce this much of everything, so effortlessly that it could afford to be frivolous. It was in that moment, standing between the Cheerios and the Frosted Flakes, that the dam inside Boris Kirillovich Volkov finally broke. The confident KGB colonel, the master of data and doctrine, the true believer in the historical inevitability of communism, began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified tearing up. He choked on a sob, a raw, guttural sound of pure anguish. He covered his face with his hands as silent, hot tears streamed down his cheeks. He wept for his entire life, a life spent in service to a monstrous, inefficient lie. He wept for his wife, who would be standing in a queue right now, hoping for a few withered potatoes. He wept for his son, who would never know this reality. He wept for the 280 million people of the Soviet Union, toiling and starving for a dream that this ordinary grocery store proved was a hollow, pathetic joke. He was not just shocked, he was spiritually broken. All the intelligence reports, all the theoretical models, all the years of indoctrination vaporized in the face of this simple, overwhelming truth. The West wasn't rotting. The West wasn't decadent and weak. The West was a force of nature, a logistical miracle so vast and powerful that it could create this temple of abundance and treat it as something utterly ordinary. Frank gently put a hand on his shoulder. "Boris?" he asked softly. Boris lowered his hands, his face pale, his eyes red and lost. He looked at Frank, his expression one of complete, utter defeat. He pointed a trembling finger at a stack of oranges. Is it all real?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Frank looked at him with a sad, knowing expression. "Yes, Boris," he said. "It's all real. And it's not even a particularly big one." The breakdown of Boris Volkov in the Safeway was not an isolated incident. To his handler, Frank, it was a tragically familiar scene. Over the years, the CIA had developed an unofficial but highly effective psychological tool, a kind of litmus test for the souls of men escaping the Soviet bloc. They called it, informally, the supermarket tour. They had discovered, through trial and error, that nothing shattered the ideological conditioning of a lifetime more effectively than a casual stroll down the aisles of an average American grocery store. It was more powerful than lectures on democracy, more convincing than stacks of economic data, and more devastating than showing them classified intelligence on their own system's failures. The supermarket was the truth made manifest. A defector could rationalize a B-1 bomber as a tool of aggression or a skyscraper as a monument to capitalist ego. But they could not rationalize a wall of 50 different kinds of mustard. They couldn't explain away the casual, thoughtless abundance available to any random person with a few dollars in their pocket. This experience became a systematic part of the defector resettlement program. It was the first crucial step in deprogramming a mind that had been confined in a cage of scarcity and lies. The new reality Boris had collided with wasn't a secret weapon, it was the entire system operating in plain sight. The American food system of the Cold War era was a sprawling, decentralized, and brutally efficient organism. It was a network of millions of independent farmers, thousands of competing trucking companies, hundreds of regional distributors, and tens of thousands of retail outlets, all operating without a central plan from Washington. This anarchy of the market, which Soviet theorists so confidently derided, was in fact a highly sophisticated information processing system. A spike in demand for avocados in Chicago would instantly send price signals back to growers in California, who would adjust their planting and shipping schedules accordingly. It was a daily, silent miracle of logistics that Soviet planners, with all their supercomputers and legions of bureaucrats, could never hope to replicate. Gosplan could order the production of 10 million tins of canned peas, but it couldn't ensure the cans, the labels, the transport, or the consumer desire would all align. The American supermarket, by contrast, was the endpoint of a system that was self-correcting, ruthlessly competitive, and entirely focused on a single goal: giving the consumer exactly what they wanted, when they wanted it. This wasn't a rare showcase. There were over 30,000 such supermarkets across the United States by the 1,970 seconds. From the blazing deserts of Arizona to the frozen coast of Maine, this same reality of overwhelming abundance was the unquestioned norm. The KGB was baffled. Their agents sent back reports, but the leadership couldn't comprehend the scale. They assumed the stores must be elaborate fakes or only located in wealthy areas. They never knew that the same overflowing shelves could be found next to a steel mill in Pittsburgh or a cotton field in Alabama. They were so used to their own system of privileges, special stores for the party elite, for scientists, for the military, that they couldn't grasp the democratic nature of American abundance. This shockwave was not limited to high-level KGB defectors. It struck every level of Soviet society that happened to brush against the West. Consider the case of Nikolai Petrov, a fictional but representative composite of Soviet merchant sailors of the era. A third mate on a Soviet fishing trawler, Nikolai's world was the cramped, rusty confines of his ship and the grey, crumbling port cities of the USSR. In 1982, his ship docked in Baltimore for emergency repairs. The crew was given a supervised 6-hour shore leave. To them, it was like visiting another planet. Their political officer, the Zampolit, gave them a stern lecture before they disembarked. "Comrades, do not be fooled by the superficial glitter of the West. Remember the homeless, the unemployed. This is a society of deep inequality." Nikolai and his friends, clutching the few dollars they were allowed to exchange, walked into the city. They were stunned by the sheer number of cars, by the cleanliness of the streets, by the clothes people wore. But their Zampolit's words echoed in their ears, a shield against the cognitive dissonance. Then, seeking a gift for his daughter, Nikolai was guided by a helpful port worker to a simple drugstore. It was not a supermarket, not a grand department store. Just a common Rite Aid. Nikolai walked in and was immediately paralyzed. He saw an entire aisle of brightly colored toys. He saw shelves groaning with different kinds of soap, shampoo, and toothpaste products that were chronically short in the Soviet Union. But it was a simple bin of fruit near the checkout counter that stopped his heart. It was filled with oranges. Oranges were a treasure, a rare treat that appeared in Soviet stores maybe once a year, around New Year's, commanding enormous queues. Here, they were piled high, each one a perfect, unblemished sphere of impossible color. He saw a woman nonchalantly pick up half a dozen and toss them in her basket as if they were pebbles. The price was so low he thought it had to be a mistake. He bought 2, holding them in his hands like precious jewels. He then saw the candy aisle, hundreds of different chocolate bars, chewing gums, and sweets. He had never imagined such variety could exist. He spent the rest of his money on a bag of Hershey's Kisses for his daughter and a pack of Wrigley's gum for his wife. When he got back to the ship, he showed his purchases to his crewmates. They gathered around, their eyes wide with disbelief. They passed around the chocolate, each man taking one, unwrapping the small piece of foil with the reverence of a religious ritual. The Zampolit stormed over, his face purple with rage. "Bourgeois poison," he spat. "Trinkets designed to rot your teeth and your soul." But his words were hollow. The evidence was right there, melting in their mouths. For the rest of the voyage, the men were silent, contemplative. The taste of that simple, mass-produced chocolate was the taste of a different reality, a world where such small pleasures weren't a once-in-a-decade luxury, but a trivial, everyday commodity. Nikolai never knew the full picture, but he knew one thing for certain. The system that could produce that orange and that piece of chocolate so effortlessly was not a system on the verge of collapse. The most profound shock, however, was reserved for those who were supposed to be the masters of the Soviet system itself. In the late 1972, as part of a détente-era agricultural exchange, a delegation of high-ranking Soviet agronomists and Gosplan officials was given a tour of a typical family farm in Iowa. These were not naive sailors, they were the architects of Soviet agricultural policy. They arrived full of condescending confidence, ready to lecture the American farmer on the scientific principles of socialism. What they saw horrified them. The farm was a vast, sprawling enterprise of thousands of acres, run by a single family with the help of a few hired hands. The farmer, a man in a John Deere cap, showed them his machinery. He had enormous, air-conditioned combines that could harvest 100 acres of corn in a single day. He had computerized irrigation systems and used satellite data to analyze soil composition. The Soviet officials, who were accustomed to collective farms where thousands of peasants worked with outdated, constantly breaking tractors, were speechless. They couldn't believe one family could manage such an operation. Then the farmer took them to his grain silos. They were colossal metal structures, holding more grain than an entire Soviet district might produce. "This is just my buffer," the farmer explained casually. "To play the market. The real stuff goes straight to the co-op." The visitors were baffled. They looked at each other, their faces pale. Their country was forced to import millions of tons of grain from the West every year just to avoid mass starvation. And here one man, on his own, had a personal surplus that could feed a small city. The final blow came when the farmer's wife invited them in for lunch. She laid out a spread of fried chicken, corn on the cob, fresh bread, and apple pie. It was a simple, hearty meal. One of the Soviet officials, through a translator, asked the woman how long she had to stand in line to get the ingredients. She looked at him with a completely blank, uncomprehending expression. "Line?" she asked. "I just went to the store and bought it." The translator struggled to explain the concept of the queue, of shortages, of the daily hunt for basic foodstuffs. The more he explained, the more confused and vaguely pitying the woman's expression became. The delegation ate their lunch in a stunned, funereal silence. They had come to America to see the failures of capitalism. Instead, they had witnessed a system of production so powerful, so mind-bogglingly efficient, that their own 5-year plans and collective farms were exposed as a pathetic, primitive farce. The recurring symbol of this new, terrifying reality was not a weapon or a flag, it was the shopping cart, the telezhka. In the Soviet Union, the iconic symbol of the shopper was the avoska, a collapsible string bag carried in a pocket or purse. The name itself came from the Russian word avos, meaning just in case or hopefully. The avoska was a symbol of a life built on chance and scarcity. You carried it with you at all times, on the off chance you happened to walk by a store just as a shipment of sausage or cheese arrived. It was a tool of hope against a backdrop of systemic failure. The American shopping cart was its ideological opposite. It was enormous, sturdy, and, most importantly, empty. It was not a tool of hope, it was a vessel of expectation. You took a cart at the entrance not just in case, but with the absolute, unquestioned certainty that you would find enough to fill it. The sight of an ordinary American, a housewife, a factory worker, a student pushing a cart piled high with a colorful mountain of food, was, to the Soviet eye, the ultimate display of power. It was a quiet, mundane parade of victory that happened 1,000,000 times a day in every town and city across the nation. This was the shock that became the norm. It wasn't a single event. It was a relentless, grinding pressure. A constant, silent broadcast of a reality that proved the entire Soviet experiment had failed. The Cold War, they were beginning to realize, was not being fought on the battlefields of Europe or in the skies over the Arctic. It was being won, decisively and irrevocably, in Aisle 5. The reports from agents like the one Viktor Orlov had seen, and the debriefings of men like Boris Volkov, did not simply vanish into the archives. They trickled upwards, slowly, reluctantly, through the vast, sclerotic bureaucracy of the Soviet state, until they landed with a thud on the polished desks of the men who ruled a sixth of the world's landmass. Inside the Kremlin, behind the thick, soundproofed walls of the Politburo's meeting room, a quiet, existential panic began to take hold. At first, the reaction was disbelief, followed by rage. The initial instinct of leaders like Leonid Brezhnev and Yuri Andropov was to shoot the messenger. The intelligence was dismissed as Western provocation, as evidence of compromised agents, or as simple, decadent exaggeration. They were horrified. They were men who had dedicated their lives to an ideology that promised historical victory, and they were now being told that the enemy was winning the Cold War not with missiles, but with milk and bread. In a secret 1981 session, a transcript of which was later found in the Central Committee archives, KGB Chairman Andropov presented a consolidated report on Western consumer goods production. He spoke in his typical cold, clinical monotone, but the words themselves were incendiary. He described the logistical efficiency of American food distribution, the sheer variety of products, and the price stability. He concluded, "Comrades, we have been underestimating the ideological danger of their so-called consumer society. Our people are being exposed to a level of material comfort that we cannot currently match. This gap is becoming a significant national security vulnerability." The room was heavy with a stunned silence. To admit this was to admit a fundamental failure of their entire 70-year experiment. Their system was supposed to be superior. It was supposed to provide for the worker, to eliminate the waste and inequality of capitalism. And yet, the ultimate symbol of that system's failure was the empty Soviet shopping bag, the Avoska. The party's first reaction was not to reform, but to double down on the lie. They launched a new wave of internal propaganda. The West's abundance was portrayed as a moral sickness. Documentaries shown on state television depicted Americans as obese, decadent, and spiritually empty, slaves to their material possessions. The food itself was attacked. American bread was full of chemicals. Their chickens were pumped with hormones. Their fruit was unnaturally perfect and tasteless. It was a desperate attempt to turn a crushing material defeat into a supposed moral victory. The Soviet citizen, with his simple, wholesome black bread and cabbage, was portrayed as spiritually superior to the confused American consumer, lost in a maze of pointless choices. But this propaganda was becoming increasingly ineffective. Too many people now had a brother, a cousin, a friend who had traveled abroad as a sailor, a diplomat, or an athlete. They had heard the stories. They had seen the forbidden photographs. They had tasted the contraband chocolate. The lie was becoming too difficult to sustain. Faced with a reality they could no longer deny, the Politburo did the only thing it knew how to do. It created a grand, centrally planned solution to the problems of central planning. In May 1982, Brezhnev announced the Food Program, a massive top-down initiative to finally solve the nation's chronic agricultural failures. It was the ultimate expression of Soviet thinking. They allocated an astronomical sum, 160 billion rubles, nearly a third of the entire national budget, to be invested in agriculture over the next decade. The program called for the creation of vast agro-industrial complexes, for the production of more tractors and fertilizer, for ambitious land improvement and irrigation projects. It was a brute force attack on the problem, an attempt to bury it under a mountain of rubles and steel. On paper, it was the most ambitious agricultural plan in human history. In practice, it was a colossal failure. The program was doomed from the start because it treated the symptoms of the disease, not the cause. The problem wasn't a lack of tractors, it was that the collective farm system gave farmers no incentive to use them effectively. Why work harder when your salary was fixed, and any surplus you produced was simply confiscated by the state? The problem wasn't a lack of fertilizer, It was that the fertilizer often arrived at the wrong time of year, or was the wrong chemical composition, because the planners in Moscow had no connection to the realities of the soil in Uzbekistan or Ukraine. The new agro-industrial complexes became monuments to the system's absurdity. Gleaming, state-of-the-art meat processing plants were built, but they stood idle for half the year because the chronically inefficient livestock sector couldn't provide enough animals to keep them running. Massive new grain elevators were constructed, but the decrepit rural road network meant the grain couldn't get to them before it rotted in the fields. The food program poured concrete and steel onto a system that was dying from a spiritual sickness, a complete lack of individual incentive and market signals. While a single American farmer in Iowa was adjusting his output based on real-time commodity prices from the Chicago Board of Trade, the Soviet planner was trying to manage a continent's food supply using decade-old data and rigid, 5-year quotas. They were trying to fly a supersonic jet by reading a steam engine manual. The futile nature of these countermeasures was obvious to anyone who had to live with the results. The shelves in the gastronomes remained as empty as ever, the queues grew longer. The only tangible result of the food program was a new genre of bitter jokes. What is the result of the food program? The TV is now full of food, but the refrigerator is still empty. This glaring disconnect between the state's promises and the citizens' reality had a devastating psychological impact. It bred a deep, corrosive cynicism that rotted the foundations of the regime's legitimacy. People simply stopped believing anything the government said. The official ideology became a hollow ritual, a set of phrases to be repeated in public while being mocked in private. And into this vacuum of belief flooded the symbols of the very system they were supposed to despise. Western consumer goods became the ultimate status symbols. A pair of Levi's jeans, smuggled into the country and sold on the black market for a month's salary, was not just a piece of clothing, it was a political statement. It was a rejection of the shapeless, poorly made products of Soviet light industry and an embrace of Western quality, style and individualism. A Beatles record, copied from a copy of a copy until it was barely audible, was a window into a world of creative freedom that was unimaginable in the tightly controlled Soviet cultural sphere. Even the plastic shopping bag from a Western supermarket became an icon. A brightly coloured bag with Safeway or Tesco printed on it would be carefully washed, folded, and reused for months, carried like a designer handbag. It was a small, everyday act of defiance, a quiet declaration that you were connected, however tenuously, to that other world, the world of abundance. For the KGB agents and diplomats stationed in the West, this psychological corrosion was even more acute. Their job was to wage war against a system whose material superiority was an undeniable, daily presence in their lives. They would spend their days writing reports about the inherent contradictions of capitalism, and then spend their evenings watching their children fall in love with American cartoons and crave American breakfast cereal. They were the frontline soldiers in an ideological war that they secretly knew their side was losing. They saw the full shelves, the effortless logistics, the sheer, overwhelming normalcy of Western prosperity. This cognitive dissonance was a crushing burden. It led to alcoholism, depression, and for a significant number, the ultimate act of treason, defection. Men like Boris Volkov were not anomalies. They were the logical endpoint of a system that forced its most intelligent and observant servants to live a lie. They were tasked with defending a fantasy, and the daily, mundane reality of a grocery store was enough to make them break. The unraveling was not happening in the missile silos or the tank factories. It was happening in the minds of the Soviet people and its own elite. They were fighting a war for the future while living in a present that was manifestly inferior. The Kremlin's response, more propaganda, more investment in a failed system, was like trying to patch a hole in a dam with newspaper. They could see the cracks spreading, they could hear the structure groaning, but they were ideologically incapable of doing the one thing that might have saved them. Admitting that their entire blueprint for reality was wrong. The story of the Soviet Union's collapse is not simply a story of failed economics, it is a story of a failed moral and philosophical proposition. The supermarket was not merely a building full of food, it was the final, irrefutable verdict in the 70-year trial of two opposing ideas. The core promise of communism was the creation of a new Soviet man, a selfless individual who would subordinate his own needs and desires to the greater good of the collective. The state, guided by the infallible party, would provide all that was necessary. This system demanded faith. It demanded that the citizen believe in the promise of a future utopia, even as their present reality was one of grey conformity and grinding scarcity. The American system, by contrast, was built on a foundation that was, to the Marxist mind, contemptibly individualistic. It made no grand promises of a future utopia. Instead, it offered the individual an almost infinite array of small, immediate choices. Which car to drive, which movie to see, which brand of soap to buy. The supermarket was the ultimate temple of this philosophy. It was a cathedral built to the sovereignty of the individual consumer. The choice between 20 different kinds of breakfast cereal, which had so baffled Boris Volkov, was not a sign of frivolous waste. It was a daily, tangible expression of freedom. It was the product of a system that trusted its people to make their own decisions, a system that harnessed the chaotic, creative power of millions of individual ambitions, rather than trying to suppress them in favor of a single, monolithic state plan. The Cold War, therefore, was won not just by America's industrial might in building aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines, but by its far more complex and profound ability to orchestrate a logistical symphony that could deliver a ripe tomato to a kitchen in Minnesota in the middle of January. This was the true demonstration of a superior system. The Soviet Union could concentrate immense resources to achieve singular, monumental goals, sending a man to space, building the world's largest nuclear bomb. But it was utterly incapable of solving the far more complex equation of feeding its own people with dignity and variety. The planned economy was a sledgehammer in a world that required a surgeon's scalpel. It was a blunt instrument of brute force, while the market economy was an infinitely adaptable, self-correcting organism. This was the final, crushing realization for the Soviet leadership. They had built a military to rival the world, but they had built a society that could not compete with a single, well-stocked grocery store. Their system had created the Avoska, the string bag of desperate hope. The American system had created the shopping cart, the vessel of confident expectation. The moral and industrial victory was complete. The ultimate demonstration of this truth did not come from a defector's debriefing, but from the stunned confession of a man who would soon preside over the Soviet Empire's dissolution. In September of 1989, just 2 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall, a rising political star named Boris Yeltsin, then a member of the Supreme Soviet, made his first visit to the United States. During a stop in Houston, Texas, his hosts, as part of the tour, took him to a mid-sized, ordinary grocery store, a Randall's supermarket. What happened next was a historical echo of Boris Volkov's personal trauma, but played out on the world stage. Yeltsin, a man who came from the absolute pinnacle of the Soviet elite, walked into the store and was visibly shattered. He wandered the aisles in a daze, his face a mask of disbelief. He stared at the meat counter, at the endless varieties of cheese, at the colourful displays of fresh produce. He stopped at the frozen food aisle and was shown a display of Jell-O pudding pops. He spoke with the store manager about inventory and pricing. He asked customers about what they were buying and if they had to wait in line. The answers he received, confirming this effortless abundance, left him speechless. Later, on his plane, Yeltsin was grim and withdrawn. He confessed to his companions what the experience had done to him. The official record and his own autobiography document his words. He said, "For a long time on the plane to Miami, I sat motionless, my head in my hands. What have they done to our poor people?" He later wrote that the visit to the Randall's supermarket was the moment that crushed him. He wrote that if the Soviet people, who were then suffering under a rationing system for basics like sugar and soap, could see the reality of a grocery store like this, there would be a revolution. This was not a low-level analyst or a disillusioned sailor. This was a man at the heart of the Soviet power structure, a man who was supposed to be a true believer, admitting complete and utter defeat. He understood in that moment that the glowing production reports from Gosplan were a lie. He understood that the propaganda about the rotting West was a fantasy. He understood that his entire country was a Potemkin village, and that the real superpower was the one that could fill 1 million shopping carts without a second thought. 2 months later, the Berlin Wall fell. It was not pushed down by an invading army of tanks. It was chipped away, dismantled, and finally breached by ordinary people who were no longer willing to live the lie. They were drawn by the irresistible gravity of the world they saw on their forbidden West German television channels. A world of freedom, a world of opportunity, a world symbolized by the overflowing shelves of the Kardowy department store. The ultimate weapon of the Cold War, turned out to be the quiet, relentless broadcast of a better reality. When the first East Germans flooded into the West, they did not rush to government buildings or military bases. They rushed to the stores, their eyes wide, with the same childlike wonder that Boris Volkov and Boris Yeltsin had experienced. They stood in front of fruit stands, weeping at the sight of bananas. They were stunned. They were baffled. They couldn't believe it was all real. In the end, the Soviet Union was not conquered from without, but hollowed out from within. It was defeated by a truth so simple and so powerful that no amount of propaganda could conceal it forever. The confident pronouncements of Colonel Morozov in his windowless briefing room, his grainy slides showing a sick and dying America, were revealed to be nothing more than the desperate incantations of a dying faith. The system built on the promise of collective triumph produced only shared misery. The system built on the foundation of individual choice produced a level of prosperity that its rival could only dream of. The Cold War was a long, twilight struggle fought with spies, soldiers and scientists. But the final, decisive battle was waged in the bright, clean, fluorescent-lit aisles of a supermarket. It was a battle of ideas, and the evidence of the victor was stacked high, in glorious, overwhelming abundance. The laughter of the German pilots who first saw the P-47 Thunderbolt was the laughter of arrogance, an ignorance that was soon corrected by overwhelming firepower. The laughter of the Soviet theorists who derided the anarchy of the market was the laughter of an ideology that had blinded itself to reality, an ignorance that was ultimately corrected by the simple, devastating truth of an empty shelf versus a full one. The thunder had spoken, but this time its voice was the humble, incessant beep of a cash register, ringing up a victory that changed the world.